Welcome to the Explainer. Okay, let me ask you a question. When you get married in a church, who really has the final say over that union? Is it the priest who performed the ceremony, or is it a judge? Today, we are diving into this really fascinating case out of the Philippines that actually forced the country's Supreme Court to answer that exact question. And this is the big question at the very heart of the story of Jerrysus and Elizabeth Tilar. You see, their attempt to end their marriage got blocked by a court for a pretty shocking reason. A reason that would end up forcing this huge showdown over where a sacred religious rite ends and a civil contract begins. So, let's get into it. First, let's talk about the couple at the center of this whole legal puzzle, Jerrysus and Elizabeth. So their story starts out like a lot of others. They had a Catholic wedding ceremony, they had a son, but things started to fall apart. After about 6 years of what was described as frequent quarrels, they separated. And then another 8 years go by before Jerrysus finally goes to court to try and make it official by filing for a declaration of nullity. Now, his whole case was built on this legal concept called psychological incapacity. To prove it, Jerrysus brought in a clinical psychologist who testified that his wife had personality disorders that, in the psychologist's opinion, made it impossible for her to handle the basic duties of marriage. Okay, so this is where a pretty standard, if sad, marital case just goes completely off the rails. You'd think the Regional Trial Court, or RTC, would look at the evidence, right? Hear both sides, make a decision? Nope. Instead, they just threw the case out. They didn't even hear it. Why? They claimed they had no power, no jurisdiction to rule on it in the first place. And you have to hear the court's reasoning for this. It's pretty wild. The judge basically said that because this was a Catholic wedding, a sacrament, it was a purely religious matter, and for a state court to rule on it would violate the separation of church and state. The court essentially said, sorry, this is the church's business, not ours. And that right there perfectly sets up the central conflict. On one side, you have the court saying a church wedding is a sacred thing, governed only by the church's own rules, what they call canon law. But on the other side, you have the petitioner arguing, wait a minute, every marriage, no matter where it happens, is a civil contract, and it has to follow state law. Well, after getting shut down by the lower court, Jerrysus Tilar didn't just give up. No, he took his case all the way to the top. And with that move, this was no longer just about one couple's personal dispute. This became a huge constitutional test case. The Supreme Court now had to step in and draw a really clear line between the power of the church and the power of the state when it comes to marriage. So, how did the Supreme Court figure this out? Well, they started by going right back to the basics, the country's own constitution. The very first thing the Supreme Court did was point right to this line in the Constitution. They made it clear that the state has a huge, undeniable interest in protecting marriage. It's not just some private deal between two people. It's a social institution, the very foundation of the family, and the state has a duty to protect it. Then they looked at the family code, which defines marriage not as a sacrament but as a special contract. And see that part that says not subject to stipulation? That's actually super important. It means you can't just make up your own rules for your marriage contract. The terms, what it is, what happens because of it, all of that is dictated by state law. The law is also really clear on what makes a marriage legally valid. It lays out two sets of rules that absolutely everyone has to follow. You've got the essential stuff like, being of age and actually consenting, and then you have the formal stuff like getting a license and having an authorized person officiate the ceremony. And now this part is absolutely crucial. Take a look at who the state says can legally marry people. Yes, priests and other religious leaders are on the list, but they're right there alongside judges and ship captains. Their legal power to perform a marriage doesn't come from their religion. It comes from the state, which makes them register, just like any other official. So here's the bottom line. It's the state that's granting the authority here. It doesn't matter if you say I do in a courtroom or in a massive cathedral. In the eyes of the law, you are entering into the exact same civil contract. The ceremony is just the wrapping paper, but the contract is the actual gift, and the state is the one who wrote the rules for it. All right, so after laying all of that legal groundwork, what was the Supreme Court's final decision? Well, the verdict was about as clear as it gets. The Supreme Court pointed to the very law that created the court system in the first place, and it explicitly says that regional trial courts have exclusive original jurisdiction in these cases. The lower court wasn't just wrong, it had completely misunderstood its own job. And here's the final word from the top court. They didn't actually rule on whether Jerrysus' marriage was null or not. They didn't have to. They basically kicked the case right back downstairs and gave the lower court a very direct order. You have jurisdiction. Now do your job. So what's the big takeaway from all of this? It's a simple but really powerful idea. A church can handle the religious sacrament, absolutely, but only the state can govern the civil contract. And when there's a legal fight over that contract, it's the state's courts, not the church, that get the final say. End of story. Which leaves us with one final thought to chew on. Remember, the Constitution calls marriage an inviolable social institution. So by making it clear that one single uniform civil law applies to every single marriage, regardless of the ceremony, does that actually reinforce the idea of marriage? Does having one set of rules for everyone make the whole institution stronger? It's definitely something to think about.